There was a hidden quarry pond surrounded by limestone cliffs where my brother Liam and I used to spend our weekends. We would pack up simple cane poles, drop in waxworms, and pull out dozens of rock bass. Those quiet afternoons are the exact reason I became obsessed with angling. The quarry wasn't a popular spot, despite being teeming with fish. Local fishermen avoided it because reaching it required a brutal 2-mile trek through a dense briar thicket, a hurdle that Liam and I gladly accepted. That total isolation was the best part. It felt like we possessed a secret world that belonged only to us. Any seasoned angler knows that predatory fish feed heavily during the twilight hours. While most people prefer the pre-dawn mist, my brother and I fell into a routine of hiking out late and staying deep into the midnight hours. It became our escape from the usual small-town high school parties. It was a crisp autumn Friday when everything went south. We reached the limestone ledger just as the amber sun dipped below the tree line. By the time our lines were cast, total darkness had set in. We sat on a flat shelf of stone that perfectly held our tackle boxes and lanterns, a routine we had executed hundreds of times. As we waited for a strike, a strange ripple caught my eye near the shadowed northern bank. The displacement of water was massive, and I was shocked I hadn't heard it sooner. I nudged Liam, and the two of us squinted into the gloom, trying to decipher the silhouette. The quarry was wide, and with the fog rolling in, visibility was terrible. Then the water fractured. A massive pale shape began to break the surface where the ripples had centered. My initial thought of a record-breaking sturgeon instantly vanished. It wasn't a fish. It was far too tall, rising vertically out of the depths. Liam gasped out a curse at the exact moment the realization hit me. It was a human being. The sheer wrongness of the sight hit like ice water. Not only was someone out here in a restricted quarry past midnight, but they had been fully submerged beneath the black water for the entire hour we'd been sitting there. If they had breathed, we would have seen the bubbles. The absolute impossibility of it set my pulse racing, and every survival instinct told me to run. Liam, however, froze, arguing that the swimmer was hundreds of yards away and couldn't bother us. We sat trapped in a trance, watching the figure. It began to sway side to side in a rhythmic, mechanical motion. The movements weren't the frantic splashes of someone drowning. They were terrifyingly smooth, as if the entity was completely synchronous with the freezing water. Our fishing rods lay forgotten on the rock as we stared. Liam whispered that maybe it was a diver checking underwater valves, but I reached down and touched the surface of the quarry. The water was near freezing. No human could survive in it without a thick neoprene dry suit. Yet this figure was completely bare-shouldered. I tried to shake off the dread and told Liam we needed to pack up. When I looked at him, his face was bloodless. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide and completely vacant, staring right at the swaying shape. He had dropped his rod entirely. I snapped his name 3 times before he blinked, shaking his head as if waking from hypnosis. He muttered an apology, picked up his rod and tried to cast, but our nerves were shot. A few minutes later, Liam gripped my forearm. "Look," he whispered. I looked across the expanse just in time to see the figure slide backward into the glassy water without making a single splash. It disappeared completely. We stared at the empty space, waiting for a head to pop up. Liam pulled out his watch to time it. When the digital timer passed the 4-minute mark, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the woods. Nobody holds their breath that long in freezing water while moving. I didn't care what Liam wanted anymore. I began throwing our gear into our backpacks. Liam begged me to wait just a little longer to see when they would come up. I kept packing, the primal urge to flee screaming in my chest. Right at the 5-minute mark, the water broke again. Except this time, the ripples were barely 30 yards away from our limestone shelf. The entity hadn't just stayed underwater, it had traveled the length of a football field toward us in total darkness. Liam finally panicked. We stood up to bolt, but our eyes locked onto the figure rising from the shallows. Through the moonlight, I realized it was a young woman. She had sodden raven hair plastered to her face, wearing a simple dark sundress. And worst of all, she looked entirely ordinary, even beautiful. She looked no older than 20. Seeing a normal human face instantly disarmed my terror, making me wonder if we were overreacting to a local eccentric. She broke the silence, offering a sweet melodic, "Hello." Her tone was playful, completely ignoring the fact that she had just survived a 5-minute underwater sprint through freezing currents. She floated effortlessly, bobbing in the water like a cork. Liam, voice trembling, asked what she was doing out here. She tilted her head back, laughing softly, and said she was just enjoying the evening. When Liam asked if she was cold, she smiled widely, revealing teeth that looked just a bit too sharp in the moonlight. She glided 5 feet closer. "Come in," she whispered. "The water is perfect." The sheer insanity of the invitation snapped me out of it. I felt an overwhelming wave of malice radiating from her icy stare. I grabbed Liam's jacket, yelled, "We're leaving!" and turned my back on her. I expected her to mock us, but instead an inhuman shriek ripped through the night. "No!" she bellowed, a sound so loud it vibrated in my teeth. We dropped half our tackle and sprinted up the steep dirt trail. Behind us, the woman didn't stop. She began to wail a wordless, agonizing screech that sounded like an animal being torn apart. We could still hear the shrieking echoing through the trees when we reached the truck a mile away. Liam immediately dialed the sheriff, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the phone. He reported a distraught swimmer at the quarry, but refused to stay at the scene when the dispatcher asked, shifting the truck into drive and tearing down the gravel road. We avoided the quarry for months. When we finally returned next summer, we brought our uncle, an avid hunter who carried a sidearm. He wanted to see the place for himself, but the water remained completely still. We never saw her again. For years, Liam and I treated it as a bizarre campfire story, joking about the quarry witch to mask our lingering fear. But now that I am older, the true horror of that night weighs on me. She wasn't a swimmer, and she wasn't just mentally ill. No human being moves like that under ice-cold water. My name is Marcus, and the water is my sanctuary. Give me a rod and a reel, and I'm content, whether I'm tracking trout in streams or navigating the deep tidal creeks here in the coastal lowlands of Georgia. This nightmare took place last April, out on the brackish backwaters with my lifelong fishing partner, Mateo. We were targeting redfish in a labyrinth of tidal creeks, a maze we'd paddled dozens of times. The Georgia salt marshes are shallow and notoriously unforgiving, so we loaded up my heavy-duty tandem kayak. It was early spring, meaning the air carried a sharp chill, and the plash of the marsh water against the hull was freezing. After paddling for about 2 miles into the tall marsh grass, we found a deep bend that looked perfect. The marsh was dead silent. There wasn't another soul out there, which was exactly the kind of solitude we chased. We cracked open a thermos of coffee and cast our lines into the stillness. An hour passed before Mateo's line went taut. Something heavy was pulling hard. In his excitement to net the fish, Mateo leaned dangerously far over the gunwale of the kayak. I saw the disaster unfolding a microsecond before it happened. As he tilted, his brand new smartphone slipped from his chest pocket and vanished into the gray, opaque water. Mateo was furious. He kept repeating that his insurance would replace a broken phone, but not one sitting at the bottom of a swamp. He couldn't afford a replacement, and honestly, neither could I. I agreed to help him look. Even though the marsh water was thick with suspended sediment, you couldn't see past your own wrist. We spent 20 minutes drifting in circles, using the blades of our paddles to scrape the bottom, hoping to hit something metallic. It was useless. The floor of the creek was a shifting soup of dead vegetation and deep, pliant mud. We quickly lost track of the exact spot where it fell. I told Mateo it was gone and we should just enjoy the day, but he refused to give up. Before I could argue, Mateo stripped down to his boxers. He announced he was going overboard to walk the creek bed and feel for the device with his bare feet. It wasn't the worst plan, considering the paddles were useless. The moment his feet touched the sludge, he let out a sharp gasp from the thermal shock. The water came all the way up to his chest, nearly 5 feet deep, but his stubbornness won out. He began shuffling through the muck, sweeping his feet back and forth. I watched anxiously from the kayak. The cold was brutal, and I knew hypothermia would set in if he stayed under much longer. I kept praying he'd either hit the phone or just give up. Then Mateo's face contorted in pure shock. His torso violently jerked forward. One second he was standing steady, and the next he was violently sucked straight down beneath the surface. My first thought was that he had stepped into a sudden drop-off or stumbled over a submerged log. But 5 seconds passed, then 10, and the water above him remained completely still. No bubbles, no splashing. Panic overtook me. I tore off my boots and heavy coat, preparing to dive into the freezing marsh to drag him out. Suddenly, Mateo erupted from the water. He was choked with black mud, his eyes wide with a primal terror I had never seen in another human being. "Paddle, go! Get us out of here!" he screamed frantically, scrambling into the kayak with manic strength. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed the paddle and dug into the water, propelling us away from the bend as fast as my shoulders allowed. Mateo was shivering uncontrollably, staring back at the ripples in the creek as if a monster was about to break the surface behind us. Once we reached the main river channel, I stopped paddling. What happened down there? Mateo pressed his hands against his face to stop the shaking. He explained that as he was clearing a patch of weeds with his foot, something had clamped onto his left ankle and violently dragged him downward. He struggled to find the words to describe it. He said it wasn't the jaws of an alligator or the smooth skin of a giant catfish. It felt like a cluster of cold, muscular appendages that wrapped tightly around his bone with immense pressure. He claimed that once he was dragged to the bottom, the thing tried to pull him horizontally into a submerged cavern beneath the marsh grass. He had to kick repeatedly with his free leg, striking the mass until it finally released its grip, allowing him to break for the surface. We loaded the kayak onto the truck in absolute silence. Mateo didn't say a single word the entire drive home. I tried to rationalize it, suggesting it was a massive snapping turtle or a stray bull shark, but I wasn't the one who felt the grip. Mateo knew the local wildlife, and he swore this was something else entirely. I still fish those coastal marshes, but the joy's gone. Every time the water turns murky or a stray piece of seaweed brushes against my kayak, a cold spike of dread hits my stomach. Something lives in the deep mud of those backwaters, and it isn't looking for bait. This event took place last summer, and it still keeps me awake on quiet nights. It involved my usual weekend crew, Elijah, Maya, Chloe, and myself. We were looking for a place to hang out on a warm Saturday evening when Elijah suggested an old county reservoir located just past Chloe's neighborhood. Elijah and I were avid bass fishermen and knew the reservoir held some massive largemouths, so we brought our gear. Maya and Chloe were just looking forward to sitting by the water, sharing a six-pack, and maybe waiting if the night stayed warm. The reservoir sat deep in the forestry area, requiring a 10-minute drive down. Dirt roads and a brief trek through a broken chain-link fence marked with faded "No Trespassing" signs. The fence had a massive tear in it that looked years old, which we always joked was our private portal to a hidden paradise. The reservoir was beautiful, a dark basin of clear water hemmed in by ancient pines. On the southern bank sat a small patch of gravelly sand we nicknamed the Ridge. It was completely isolated, meaning we could play music and talk as loudly as we wanted without anyone bothering us. The twilight was fading when we slipped through the wire. Elijah and I immediately began assembling our spinning rods, while the girls laid out a blanket and opened some drinks. The atmosphere was perfect. As the girls were discussing whether the water was warm enough for a swim, Maya stopped mid-sentence. She pointed toward a thick cluster of cattails 50 yards down the bank. "Is that a boat?" We all looked. Embedded deeply in the reeds was a weathered aluminum canoe. It was resting at a bizarre angle, floating freely as if it had recently drifted into the weeds rather than being intentionally moored. We had frequented this reservoir for over a year and had never seen another vessel out here. Driven by curiosity, Elijah and I decided to walk down the shoreline to inspect it, while the girls stayed on the blanket with the music playing. The walk took only a few minutes, but as we drew close, a heavy feeling of unease settled over me. The canoe wasn't abandoned junk. It was loaded with active gear. An expensive graphite fishing rod was resting against the gunnel, its monofilament line trailing directly down into the deep water. An open tackle box sat on the center seat. its lures scattered as if someone had been interrupted while picking a bait. Even weirder, a half-eaten apple and a fresh bottle of water sat in the bow. But the centerpiece of the scene was a smartphone lying face up on the bench. The screen was locked, but the built-in flashlight was turned on, casting a stark beam against the aluminum hull. I looked at Elijah. Who walks away from their phone with the light running? Elijah didn't answer. His face had gone serious. A fisherman might leave his tackle if he stepped into the woods to relieve himself, but no one leaves a live line in the water, a fresh meal, and a glowing phone. It looked like the occupant had vanished into thin air just moments before we arrived. We scanned the tree line and shouted into the woods, but only the wind answered. We hurried back to the girls and explained what we saw. The details of the canoe cast an immediate chill over our party. I kept looking back toward the reeds, watching the aluminum boat rock slowly in the dark water, feeling a terrible sense of impending doom. Chloe insisted that we pack up and leave right then, and I didn't argue. The fun was gone. As we began gathering our backpacks, Chloe gasped, her finger pointing across the wide expanse of the reservoir. On the exact opposite shore, a figure was standing waist-deep in the water. Even in the dying light, the silhouette was unmistakable. They were holding a long, straight object, either a massive branch or a thick gaff. But the terrifying part was their posture. They were completely motionless, staring directly across the water at our campfire. They had been watching us in total silence. The mystery of the canoe instantly transformed into raw, visceral terror. We all knew we were in danger. We grabbed our gear and began a fast, panicked march back toward the fence line. That's when the silence broke. A gravelly, furious voice roared across the water. "You don't belong here! Get out!" the man screamed, his voice dripping with an unstable, manic rage. He kept cursing, his shouts echoing off the pine trees like a madman. I turned my head back for a split second and my heart dropped. The man dropped his staff, plunged forward, and threw his torso into the deep water. He was swimming directly toward us, cutting through the reservoir with terrifying speed. "Run!" I screamed. We sprinted through the dark woods, branches tearing at our clothes. We reached the chain-link fence and scrambled through the tear as fast as humanly possible. Being the last in line, I could hear the heavy, rhythmic slapping of water behind me as the swimmer neared our side of the bank. We dove into the car, locked the doors, and Elijah threw the vehicle into reverse, spraying gravel as we tore down the road. We parked in a well-lit grocery store lot 20 minutes later, trying to process the madness. Maya was sobbing, and Elijah was trying to comfort her, but his own hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Who was that man? Was he the owner of the canoe? Or had he done something to the person who actually belonged in that boat? The thought that we might have interrupted a crime scene made my stomach turn. Chloe wanted to call the state police, but we ultimately decided against it. We were trespassing on restricted county property, and we had no real information other than a man shouting at us to leave. It's been a year since that night, and none of us have ever spoken of returning to the reservoir. The girls refused to even drive past the access road. I still wonder what the police would have found if they dragged that dark water, but some secrets are better left undisturbed in the dark. I've never been a natural athlete, but I've always appreciated a good, sweat-inducing workout to keep myself in shape. My closest friend Vance is the exact opposite. He's a lean, disciplined marathon runner who basically acts as my personal drill sergeant. Because our daytime schedules were always completely packed, Vance and I fell into a strict routine of running late at night through my suburban subdivision. It was generally a very quiet, well-lit neighborhood with a low crime rate. We always felt perfectly safe there, but we hasn't laced up our running shoes in that neighborhood since a terrifying incident that happened exactly 2 months ago. To understand how we got trapped, you need to understand the layout of my neighborhood. It consists of one long, winding main loop with several small cul-de-sacs branching off it like ribs. At the furthest point of the loop, the asphalt abruptly ends and turns into a rugged fire trail that cuts through dense pine woods, eventually leading out to vast private horse pastures. One humid night, we decided to vary our route to push our stamina. We started at my driveway, took a shortcut path through the woods to reach one of the isolated cul-de-sacs, ran back up to the main loop, and planned to sprint down the dark fire trail before looping back to my house. It was a convoluted path, but our standard 3-mile loop on the paved roads was getting too monotonous. We started off strong, jogging shoulder to shoulder and just gossiping about work drama. But shortly after entering the wooded shortcut, we heard the distinct sound of heavy footfalls behind us. At first, we didn't panic. The trail was a popular spot for local hikers during the day, and seeing another late-night jogger wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. But as we pushed forward, the footsteps stayed perfectly synchronized with ours. When Vance picked up the pace to a hard sprint, the footsteps behind us accelerated. When we dropped down to a slow, deliberate walk to catch our breath, the presence behind us slowed down to match our exact rhythm. By this point, my adrenaline was spiking, but the glow of the streetlights at the end of the trail was finally in sight. The moment our sneakers hit the asphalt of the lit cul-de-sacs, we spun around to see who it was. The path behind us was completely empty. Vance and I exchanged a tense, uneasy look. We tried to laugh it off, assuming it was just some other runner playing a weird game of pacing with us. Trying to shake off the growing dread, we pushed forward, taking the main road all the way to where the streetlights ended and the dark dirt fire trail began. Even though my gut was telling me to head home right then, we felt a runner's high and decided to head down the unlit dirt road anyway. The canopy of overgrown trees completely blocked out the moonlight, creating an incredibly oppressive atmosphere. We ran about a mile into the pitch black before deciding to turn back. Just as we spun around, my headlamp caught a sudden movement. It was a tall, dark shape, darting wildly behind a thick oak tree on the left. The memory of those synchronized footsteps rushed back, and a cold sweat broke out across my neck. I grabbed Vance's shoulder and whispered that someone was hiding in the trees ahead of us. Vance scoffed, telling me the darkness and fatigue were just playing tricks on my eyes. I wanted to believe him so badly, so I forced myself to keep jogging back toward the light. We passed the oak tree without incident, but just as the paved road came back into view, a violent rustling erupted in the dry brush. Barely 20 feet behind us, we spun around, our chest lamps cutting through the dark. Standing dead center on the dirt road was a man. He was standing with his back to us. He wore a heavy, stained gray hoodie, tattered, mud-caked cargo pants, and worn-out work boots. My heart hammered so hard against my ribs I thought it would fracture. I literally couldn't breathe. Vance stepped forward, trying to sound brave, and shouted, "Hey, what's your problem?" But he was cut off by a sound that made my skin crawl. The man began to laugh. It was a high-pitched, manic, wet cackle that echoed horribly off the trees. Still laughing, the figure slowly rotated his body to face us. Then the laughter stopped instantly. He just stared. His eyes were stretched incredibly wide, showing the whites all around his dilated pupils, and his face was a deathly, pale white. That empty, predatory glare is burned into the back of my eyelids to this day. Vance and I didn't say a single word. We turned and ran faster than we ever had in our entire lives, sprinting the full 2 miles back to my house without looking back once. As we fled, that sickening cackle rose up in the distance behind us, urging us to run even faster. The moment we burst through my back door, I collapsed over the utility sink and threw up from sheer exhaustion and terror. We locked every window, bolted the doors, and sat in the dark hallway waiting for morning. We have never run at night again. If you prefer to exercise in the dark, please stick to populated roads and never go out without protection. During my junior year of high school, I was deeply committed to the varsity cross-country team. My favorite way to clear my head was running solo. I wasn't exactly the sprinter's favorite, but I possessed relentless stamina and loved zoning out to the steady, rhythmic slap of my sneakers against the gravel. To make some extra cash, I took a job walking and running a high-energy Siberian husky puppy named Rogue for a wealthy woman who lived in an isolated rural community bordering a state forest. She offered me $15 a run, which at the time felt like a jackpot. The area was beautiful but desolate, It was dotted with decaying barns, an overgrown pioneer cemetery, and the ruins of an old abandoned religious commune. My parents always warned me about training in such isolated areas, but I figured my speed was my ultimate insurance policy. I was dead wrong. It was late October. The twilight was bleeding into a deep, bruised purple, and the setting sun threw long, distorted shadows across the asphalt, making the woods look dense and impenetrable. The only sounds were my steady breathing, Rogue's rhythmic panting, and the crunch of gravel under my feet. But the further we went, the more the natural sounds of the forest seemed to die out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence. About 2 miles from the client's house, the road narrowed into a corridor of ancient, overgrown pines. Suddenly, Rogue halted. Her ears shot forward and her entire body locked up. She stared intently into the thicket, letting out a low, terrified whimper. I followed her gaze. Hidden between 2 thick pine trunks, a man was watching us. He was short and stocky, wearing a grimy canvas cap pulled low, a heavy winter coat despite the mild autumn air, and thick leather gloves. His unblinking eyes were locked directly onto mine. The absolute stillness of his posture made my stomach turn. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a local landowner or a hunter, but there was an unmistakable aura of malice radiating from him. He didn't look like someone who belonged in the woods. He looked like a predator waiting in ambush. I gave a stiff, polite nod to keep up appearances and urged Rogue back into a jog. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but we had only gone a few yards when Rogue stopped again, tucking her tail flat against her stomach. I spun around and my breath caught. The man had advanced. He was no longer hiding. He was standing right at the edge of the asphalt, only a few feet away, staring with his head tilted at an unnatural, bird-like angle. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He wanted me to see him. He was playing with me. Instinct told me to bolt, but I forced myself to maintain a steady, composed jog. If I panicked, it might trigger a chase. I kept my eyes forward, but I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds. For a moment, the road behind us looked empty. But as I turned my head back around, a flash of movement caught my left eye. I looked back. He was in a full sprint, charging directly at me. And in his gloved right hand, he held a massive, rusted butcher's cleaver. A choked gasp escaped my throat as pure, unadulterated terror flooded my nervous system. I didn't think. I just ran. The adrenaline hit my muscles like rocket fuel, and I pushed my body past any limit I had ever reached on the track. Rogue struggled to keep pace, her leash pulling taut as we flew down the dark road. I looked back once. He was gaining ground. His face was contorted into a mask of silent fury, his teeth bared. He was running with a bizarre, disjointed gait, his arms swinging wildly, his legs churning in unnatural, jerky strides, like a puppet being jerked by strings. And then, the worst realization of all hit me. He wasn't breathing. In the quiet of the country road, I could hear my own ragged gasps, the heavy panting of the dog, and the wind in the trees. But from him, there was nothing. No heavy breathing, no grunts of exertion, just the terrifying rhythmic thud of his heavy boots closing the distance in absolute dead silence. We reached the edge of a residential development, and I darted wildly between 2 houses, weaving through backyards and jumping low garden fences to break his line of sight. My lungs were burning, my vision was tunneling, but I knew stopping meant death. Finally, I pulled Rogue behind a plastic garden shed, pressing my back against the wall, trying to stifle my sobbing breaths. Silence. I waited, my heart drumming in my ears. Slowly, I peered around the edge of the plastic wall. At the crest of the hill, standing under the dim glow of a street lamp, the man stood watching. The heavy cleaver hung loose at his side. His chest rose and fell slowly, but his face was entirely devoid of emotion now. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, vacant stare. A car turned the corner in the distance, its bright headlights sweeping across the yard. In the blink of an eye, the man turned on his heel and walked calmly back into the dark woods. No panic, no rush, just gone. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours before taking the most erratic, hidden route back to the client's house. My hands shook violently as I took my $15. I never told her, And I never told my parents, knowing they would instantly forbid me from ever running again. I still don't know who he was, whether a squatter from the old commune, a drifter, or something worse, but I never ran toward those woods again. The nightmare I am about to recount took place over the course of nearly 7 years. I live in a quiet, sprawling subdivision nestled in the deep farmlands of Ohio. It's a beautiful, picturesque area, but the vast fields and empty country lanes make it incredibly isolating. It was a feeling of confinement that became almost unbearable during the 2020 lockdowns. The first time I encountered the shadow was when I was 9 years old. My younger brother, who was 7 at the time, and I were walking our golden retrievers near the entrance of our subdivision, where it connects to the main state route. We were laughing and throwing sticks, completely oblivious to our surroundings. Suddenly, a voice hissed from the dark, "Hey kids, come over here for a second." A massive white SUV was idling at the shoulder of the road. The driver's side window was rolled down, and a man was leaning out, gesturing for us to approach his vehicle. I remember his features vividly. He was a tall, pale man with tight, curly blonde hair. My brother naively took a step toward the car, but my protective instincts flared. I grabbed his arm, spun us around, and marched us back toward our house. I kept looking over my shoulder. The moment the man realized we were fleeing, he hit the gas and sped away into the farmlands. When we got home, I told my mother, but she brushed it off, suggesting he was just a lost motorist looking for directions. I tried to forget about it, but the memory lingered. A year later, during Halloween, a black sedan with no license plates began slowly tailing groups of young trick-or-treaters down our street. When an angry parent stepped off the curb to confront the driver, the sedan accelerated, nearly striking him before roaring out of the neighborhood. The local parents were terrified, especially since a high-profile abduction had occurred in a neighboring county just months prior. Fast forward 4 years to the summer of 2018. Our next-door neighbors went on a 2-week trip to Europe and hired me to pet sit their elderly basset hound. I had to walk over to their house 3 times a day. Their property sat on a heavily wooded lot at the far edge of the subdivision. To get there, I could either walk the paved road or take a shortcut through a dense, overgrown patch of woods. Because the brush was full of thorns, I usually stuck to the asphalt. One night, I got distracted playing video games with my friends and realized with horror that it was past 10:30 p.m., well past the dog's final walk time. I grabbed a flashlight and ran down the dark street. Thankfully, the dog was fine. I let him out, fed him, and was about to lock up when I glanced out the front window. A black sedan was parked silently at the edge of the dark driveway, its headlights turned off. My stomach dropped. I knew for a fact the car hadn't been there when I arrived, and there were no other houses nearby. Fearing the worst, I bypassed the front door, slipped out the back, and braved the thick, thorny woods to get back to my house. I never saw the black car again that summer, but I strictly used the woods for the rest of the pet-sitting gig. I thought these were just random, isolated events until recently. As a member of my school's varsity track team, the quarantine meant I had to train alone on the empty country roads surrounding my house. I always ran on the left shoulder, facing oncoming traffic, so no vehicle could sneak up on me from behind on the blind curves. About a month ago, during my afternoon run, I noticed a vehicle matching my speed on the opposite side of the road. It was a large white SUV. It crawled along at a snail's pace, keeping perfect distance with my jog. Terrified, I took a sudden detour down a dead-end cul-de-sac. The SUV didn't follow me down the street, so I waited a few minutes and ran home. The next day, it happened again. This time, the white SUV was parked at the edge of a cornfield, pulling out to follow me the exact moment I passed. It tailed me for a mile until I utilized the same cul-de-sac trick to escape. This cat-and-mouse game continued daily for 10 days. To test if it was just a coincidence of schedules, I changed my running time by 2 hours. The first day was clear, but on the second day, the white SUV was waiting for me again. I was terrified to tell my parents because I knew they would forbid me from training, so I kept silent and tried to stay hyper-vigilant. On the 11th day, I ran down my detour cul-de-sac only to find a black sedan parked at the very end of the circle. As I drew closer, my eyes adjusted to the shadows. Curled up tightly underneath the chassis of the sedan was the silhouette of a man hiding in the dirt to avoid being seen. A wave of pure panic hit me. I spun around to run back to the main road, but the white SUV had pulled up to the entrance of the cul-de-sac, completely blocking my path. I was trapped. With no other choice, I summoned every ounce of my track training. I put my head down and launched into a full sprint directly toward the white SUV. Just as I got within 10 feet, the driver's side door flung open, and a man lunged out to grab me. My months of rigorous conditioning paid off. I dodged his reach and outpaced him easily. Realizing he couldn't catch me on foot, he screamed after me, "Stop! Come back here! I just want to talk to you." I didn't look back. I sprinted the final mile to my house at record speed, burst through the door, and told my mother everything. We called the police immediately, but without a license plate number, there was little they could do besides promise increased patrols. It has been weeks, and the terror of that afternoon still haunts my dreams. After connecting the dots, the horrifying truth is undeniable. These men have been actively hunting and attempting to abduct a child from our street for over 7 years. And the man who jumped out of the SUV to grab me? He was tall with distinct curly blonde hair. It was the exact same man who had tried to lure me into his car when I was 9 years old. Be careful when you're out alone, even in your own neighborhood. You never know who has been watching you and for how long.